I've been wanting to do this for a long time, rating every single game system that I own that is not handheld. Starting off with the oldest game system that I own, the 1985's American Nintendo Entertainment System, which in Japan, 83. But it had a lot of games that are considered classic. Unfortunately, there are a lot of really crappy games on that system that does affect the game ratings, unfortunately. But it did have Mario Brothers, it had Metroid, it had Ice Climbers, it had Donkey Kong games, it had a lot of classic games, nostalgia games, and some of them don't age well. The controller, after a while, it kind of hurts your hands. I don't know if that's just me, but I like the design of the Nintendo Entertainment System. It's a little bulky looking, but overall the gameplay and the sound is pretty decent for the time. Sometimes the game system, you had to blow into the thing, even though they say you're not supposed to do that. Sometimes it would work, sometimes it didn't work. But overall, I would give it an 8.5 out of 10 just because it's a classic game system. And it had not one, not two, but 3 classic Mario video games on that system. And it was one of the best systems to come out in the 80s. And it basically saved the video game industry. So that's why it gets an 8.5. The Sega Genesis. The very first game system I ever owned. The very first game system I ever played. So this came out in 1989 in America. Bundled with Altered Beast. I think the one my mom had was the one with Altered Beast. And in Sonic, I don't remember. But it's the very first system I had. It had a unique soundtrack, a 3-button controller. I prefer the 6-button controller, especially if you're playing some of the later games. You cannot play a 3-controller with that. It introduced us to Sonic the Hedgehog, one of the most iconic video game characters ever to exist, to rival against Nintendo. It had unique characters, which unfortunately they didn't use and later on until maybe now. Like, you had Streets of Rage, you had Altered Beast, you had Rinstar, you had so many other, like Golden Axe. You had so many good games that Sega ignored for Sonic, unfortunately. And that probably led to its downfall of it not having any more consoles anymore. But the Sega Genesis, overall, I would have to give it a 9 out of 10. You had a unique soundtrack, and it had the better port of Mortal Kombat, the original. And there are some lackluster ports of the Sega Genesis that are inferior to the Super Nintendo, and then there's Sega Genesis versions that are better than the Super Nintendo versions, so it goes hand in hand. But overall, a 9 out of 10. Huge nostalgia. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System, also called the NES. To me, it's one of the greatest video game consoles, period. There was Super Mario World, we had Super Metroid, we have F-Zero, we had Donkey Kong Country, we have all the Legend of Zelda games, we have Final Fantasy, we had so many great games on that system, it ain't even funny. And a huge improvement from the Nintendo Entertainment System, better controller, better sound, better graphics, better everything. Also, the nostalgia of me and my friend playing the game system a long time ago. This is, plus 25 years ago, playing Super Mario World. It was funny because I had the Genesis and he had Super Nintendo. Um, there's just a lot of really great games on there. And of course, there are some bad ports of certain games. There's certain like fighting games that were ported onto there. They were not really great. The first Mortal Kombat game for the Super Nintendo, they censored out the blood. But overall, it is one of the greatest systems of all time. And I give it a 9.8 out of 10. And there hasn't been really a system that had a ton of games like that for the longest time that were as great to me. So 9.8. The Sony PlayStation. So one of my best friends had the Sony PlayStation, while my other friend had the Super Nintendo, and another friend of mine had the N64, while I had the Sega Genesis. So I would always go over to his house to play Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, the Gran Turismo games. At the time, all those games were considered masterpieces. You had the Tomb Raider games. You had Tekken. The Final Fantasy games went on PlayStation. It was one of the best-selling game systems of all time. And I see why, but there was plenty of bad games on there, but it didn't outshine the good ones, in my opinion. And the PlayStation 1, wasn't a really huge fan of the controller. I kind of like the ones with the little, I don't know, the little, I don't know. I had an issue with the first PlayStation controller when it first came out. I like the other second model version of the controller better, but like I said, it had a ton of great games on it. You could play CDs on there. You could, there was a lot of stuff on there that you could do on there. You could use the certain games, you could actually put it in a CD player and play the music. It had some of the best fighting games on there. It had some of the best racing games. Had some of the greatest platformers. Some of the graphics didn't age well for certain games, but it's still fun to go back and play some of those games. But yeah, PlayStation 1 was probably a 9.5 or a 9.3. I would give it a 9.5 since there was a ton of great games on there. So the Sega Saturn, the very first Sega flop, unfortunately for Sega, it is actually a very underrated system if you have the RAM for it. I actually like the controller. I actually like the games that are on there. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of games on there that I would have liked to have. Like, you would have to get the Japanese port of certain games if you wanted close to arcade perfect. X-Men versus Street Fighter or X-Men Children of the Atom. Like the early Marvel versus Capcom titles, basically. Unfortunately, it did not sell very well, and I think the main problem with that was they just didn't put enough games on there. I don't even really think there was a lot of Sonic games on there. I don't have the Sega CD, and technically that was really the first flop for Sega, but overall, I would give it an 8 out of 10. I didn't grow up playing the Sega Saturn. I think I played it maybe once in my entire life before I owned it, which was not that long ago. And I really think that the Sega Saturn was a really good system if it would have had more games on there, which is a real shame because the Sega Saturn was on the level of PlayStation almost if it would have had more games. The Nintendo 64, one of my all-time favorite consoles, but unfortunately, going back to it, it hasn't aged well in terms of certain things like the controller. I know a lot of people have a problem with the controller. I kind of do, but kind of don't. The graphics are pretty decent for its time. It was cartridge based. They wanted to keep doing cartridge based, but it had some of the greatest games on on the console. But for to me, it honestly didn't have as much games as you really think on there. But it had Mario 64, Mario Kart 60, Mario Kart 64, Super Mario 64, GoldenEye, Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, Smash Brothers, Pokemon Stadium, Donkey Kong, Diddy Kong, Star Fox, Banjo-Kazooie. It had all those classics right there, but the system didn't sell quite as well as they thought it was going to be. I love the N64 to death. And unfortunately, there are some some ports of certain games that are not great. Like the Sony PlayStation versions of most of those games were superior than the N64 because of how much space they have, because it's a cartridge versus a CD. But the N64, I have to give a 9.3 out of 10. I would want it to be, if it would have been me rating this 20 years ago, I would have been like 9.8 or something. But some of the games didn't age well, and unfortunately there's not enough stuff that you can do on there, and not enough cool stuff you can do on there, but still a really great console though. The Sega Dreamcast. Unfortunately, it was the final Sega console system, which is a real shame because it came out in 1998 and ended in 2001. Didn't have a huge lifespan. The controller, probably my third or second least favorite controller, but man, a lot of those games on the system, unfortunately, again, it lacked a lot of games for that system, like the Sega Saturn to me, and there were a lot of great games. It was the start of NBA 2K on that system, if you guys didn't know that. And we had Sonic Adventure, we had Marvel vs. Capcom, we had basically the best port of Marvel vs. Capcom 1 and 2, and probably the best for fighting games on that system. You had Soul Calibur, the first Soul Calibur game was on there. I mean, you had Mortal Kombat Gold, which was an updated version of Mortal Kombat 4. The only way to get that game is to have it on the Sega Dreamcast, which was an odd choice. But this was the start of online, like you can play people online. Not even Sony had that yet, I don't think. And I would give the Sega Dreamcast about an 8.5, only because that it had not one of my favorite controllers and the lack of games, but there are some really good games on that system, which is a real shame because it didn't sell well, and it's a real shame. Sony's PlayStation 2 or PS2, released in 2000, 24 years ago, one of the best gaming systems to be sold ever, period, and one of the greatest systems ever. I can't say how many great games were on that system. You could play DVD on the system, and that was groundbreaking for its time. Now it's like, the normal thing to do on a console. You had you could play online, you could have DVD, you could play all your friends online. So many great games. Like the controller. Design on the console itself was okay, but man, the PS2, it lasted a very, very long time. But from like 2000 to 2012. Yeah, I remember seeing NBA 2K12 on a PS2, and it probably played horrible. And the graphics, for the most part, they hold up pretty well, but the PS2 is one of the groundbreaking systems. It's one of the groundbreaking systems. I wish Sony would do, I don't know. Sony hasn't been the same since the PS2 era and PS3 era. But overall, I would give it a 9.6. That's how great the Sony PlayStation 2 was. So, two of my friends had Xbox, and I ended up having his Xbox towards the end. But the Xbox is kind of an underrated system. It didn't sell quite as well as probably Microsoft wanted to be, but the problem I feel was lackluster games. Graphically, it was amazing, and then you had Xbox Live, you had a lot of things you could do with it. At the time, there was no real HD type setting, but Xbox had that. And it had the groundbreaking Halo series, which I'm not really the biggest fan of. But you gotta admit that Halo was a game changer, I guess. And one of my favorite games on the Xbox original was Fable. And then we had the underrated Blinks the Time Sweeper, which unfortunately never got a remaster or a third game. But like I said, the problem with the Xbox was there wasn't a ton of great games on there that were exclusive. You had to get certain thing to play the DVD. I forgot what that was even called. But you could put your music on there, which was really cool. Like you could download your music on there and it would be saved on there forever. But the Xbox original, I would give it an 8 out of 10. I feel bad for giving it a lower rating than it probably should, but to me, the Xbox original was kind of weak on terms of exclusives. But it had decent it had great graphics for its time. It had pretty decent racers. It had Fable. It had Halo 1, Halo 2. It had a lot of underrated games that should have been, I don't know, remastered or had sequels to, but they, for some reason, Xbox ignored them, kind of like how Sega did, and that's why, unfortunately, Xbox is failing at right now. Nintendo GameCube, released in 2001. Some people didn't like the design. I never had a problem with the design. The controller is alright. Not my favorite Nintendo controller, but still better than Nintendo 64's controller. Underrated system. But the problem I had with the system never really occurred to me until I was older that it never had online. It didn't have stuff like where you could play DVD or CDs. But it does make up for it for the great games that are on there, though. Can't say the same thing about Xbox, unfortunately, but I mean, you had Super Mario Sunshine, and you also had one of the greatest video games of all time, Super Smash Bros. Melee. You had Metroid Prime. My favorite Mario Kart game of all time, Double Dash. You had Wind Waker, Animal Crossing, Luigi's Mansion. And then there's let's see, F-Zero GX. You know, there was a ton of games on there that were really good. Unfortunately, didn't sell quite as well. Which is a real shame because I really liked the GameCube. That was the first game system I really got after the Sega Genesis because I was pretty much broke. But you know, the I had a soft spot for the GameCube. I actually used to play the GameCube with family, and that is why also the rating is going to be kind of high for it. It's going to be at least a 9.3. The games alone make it the high rating. Yeah, it doesn't have DVD or online, but there was a ton of great games on that system. I never cared that the design looked like a lunchbox, but that's just me. The Xbox 360, I didn't have to deal with the red ring of death because I bought a later model of the 360 that I think it was like the 2010 or 11 one. So that was a huge problem. So my dad's girlfriend's kid had the original Xbox, and he started to have the red ring of death a little bit later on. But there was a ton of good games on the 360. The red ring of death will affect the rating, unfortunately. I like the controller for the 360. Particularly the later model, because I didn't really care for the white model. The 361, another problem I had with the 360 is it overheating or it gets too hot. If you move the console around, the disc will get all scratched up really bad, and then the game will become unplayable. But graphically wise and stuff that you can do on there was superior than the PS3 and the Wii during its lifespan. It had better versions of certain games compared to the PS3 and Wii. But overall, I'd probably give it an 8.5. I think the 360 is probably still to this day the best Xbox system that they had. But you know, it's hard to compete with, you know. But it had Left 4 Dead 2, Left 4 Dead, two games that I thought I wasn't going to be a huge fan of. Ended up loving Left 4 Dead 2. But overall, 8.5. The PlayStation 3. So, I never owned a PlayStation 3 until much later. I used to go over a friend's house and play the PS3 all the time. I had the 360. He had the PS3. He would play Naruto games, and I would play Blur, which was a really underrated game. The PS3 had problems because of the launch price, but the PS3 was also groundbreaking for letting you play Blu-ray. Blu-ray was basically the HD version of DVDs at the time, and people still use Blu-rays, but not as much as they used to. And I think certain PS3 models, you could backwards compatible old games of the PS1 and PS2. But the one I have, you can only play PS1 games on there. But backwards compatibility was a huge thing to me. And certain games, I think the original model of the Xbox, you could play original Xbox games on the 360. But the PS3, had some really good games. They had their own Smash Brothers game. Wasn't quite as good as Smash Brothers, but I kind of wish they would have made a remake or a sequel to the game, because it's been 12 years since they made that game. There are so many underrated games on the PS3, and there were some issues with graphically or performances wise on certain games, and that's why some of the Xbox 360 games were better. But I would give the PS3 an 8.4 out of 10. The Nintendo Wii, I had fun times with the Nintendo Wii. Had some of the best games on that system. I used to play the Wii with family, like the Wii Sports, all the Wii Resort, and then with my brother, Super Smash Brothers Brawl. Super Smash Brothers Brawl had some mixed reactions, but to me, that was the best games on that system. With Kirby's Epic Yarn, you had the Mario Galaxy games, you had the Wii Sports games. Sure, there's some crappy shovelware games in there, and the graphics didn't look quite polishing at the time, and the controller, sometimes the batteries would die, in my opinion, really fast. Maybe because I was playing it so much, but the Nintendo Wii was it was a groundbreaking system. You had a ton of games on there that you could play. I forgot to mention on the Xbox 360 how the Kinect was a huge failure on that system. But the Nintendo Wii had backwards compatibility. That was one of the big things also. You could play the Nintendo GameCube games on there. And technically not really high definition, but you could play it on bigger screen TV that was more HD. You can control your game. You can put your GameCube controllers on there. I would give the Nintendo Wii a 9.3 out of 10. Definitely a huge comeback for Nintendo for the sales. Unfortunately, the Wii U did a U-turn on that. The Wii U. Unfortunately, this game system sold horribly. It's kind of underrated, but the problem with the Wii U was honestly not enough games. There was a few remasters in there that were pretty good. You had Super Smash Brothers 4. You had the Star Fox game. You had Mario Kart 8. You had the Wind Waker remaster. You had Breath of the Wild was on there. Donkey Kong was on there. There was a lot of very good games out there. But unfortunately, there wasn't enough games on there to keep you interested. And the control pad might have confused some people. They thought it was, is this Wii number 2, like an upgrade Wii? For some people, but this is the first the first Nintendo system to have HDMI, because the Wii didn't have that back in the day. But the Wii U is kind of underrated. The one thing I like over the Wii U over the Switch is it had internet. But other than that, it's a 7.5 out of 10. I hate to put it that low. I hate to put any Nintendo system that low, but it was a huge disappointment. And most of their best games went to the Switch later on, except for the Kirby game. I can't remember what that one was called. It was the Rainbow something, but all the best Wii U games were ported to the Switch later on. So there was no point of having a Wii U. Xbox One S. I didn't buy the original Xbox One because it had a ton of issues. Like, the heating issues, the gaming prices. It was just a lot of things wrong with it when it first came out. And then the S came out, which was a little bit better. The problem is, I like the controller and all, but the buttons sometimes would be sticky. And again, not a ton of games for that Xbox One, unfortunately. The only saving grace that the Xbox One had was the Game Pass, and when they announced backwards compatibility for 360 games and original Xbox. Other than that, it would have been a total failure to me. So I give it a 7.5 out of 10. The Nintendo Switch. I had mixed reactions for it when it first came out. I waited a whole year for it to come out because it came out in 2017. And the controller, I'm not the biggest fan of. It's probably my second or least favorite controller because of the drifting. But a lot of the games were ported from older systems, like the GameCube, the Wii, and the Wii U, which isn't completely bad, but there are a ton of games that are on the Switch that are great. One of my main problems with the Switch is it doesn't have an internet browser. Sure, you can go on YouTube, but the controller drifting was a huge problem. And some of the ports are horrendous, like Mortal Kombat 11, and in like certain games, the frame rates are not good, and it only goes to 1080p, which is a real shame. Because there's some Nintendo games that look amazing, and then there's some games that look like they've been ported from 15 years ago or something. But the Nintendo Switch overall is definitely an 8.5, I guess, out of 10. There's still a ton of great games on there. The Switch isn't going anywhere anytime soon, I don't think. But they had Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, probably one of the best games that came out in 10 years, I would say. And that came out in 2018. But yeah, the Switch is definitely worth picking up. Unfortunately, some of the Pokemon games have not been great. I mean, they're good, but they haven't been great, if you know what I mean, in the past few years. So, Xbox Series X is technically the third version of Xbox One. And I'm not super impressed by it, honestly. The controller's okay. The design looks like a giant refrigerator. But it also has backwards compatibility. The 4K is on there, 4K Blu-ray, even though you could play 4K Blu-ray on the series of the Xbox One S. But the games, however, are not very impressive. It's just most of them are regular Xbox One, and then it's getting enhanced by Xbox Series X. But I would give it a 7.7. The main problem with the last two consoles that I have is if it's so graphically and all this so impressive, how come it doesn't have twice as space as the previous console generations, if you know what I mean? Like it should have 10 times the space. But other than that, it's kind of weak. The PlayStation 5. Unfortunately, the scalpers ruined it for a lot of people when it first was released. Fortunate for me, I waited like a whole entire year or two to get this system. Do I think it's worth it? Not really. Other than better speed time, which also the Xbox X was better at, was better speed time. Backwards compatibility to PS4 games, thankfully. But I wish it would have had backwards compatibility for PS3, PS2, PS1. And like I said, the problem I have with the PS5 and Xbox Series X is it should have twice the amount of space that it should have. But it doesn't. There's no internet browser on the PS5 for some reason, but on the PS4 Pro there is. And you can't really customize your background like you could on the PS4, like I could. But also the games are not really that impressive. I know it's an unpopular opinion, but a lot of those games were just ported to be an upgraded version of the PS4 games. If you really look at some of their games that they have, a lot of them are just updated versions of the PS4 version, like a deluxe edition kind of. That's what I have a problem with this last generation of gaming, honestly. But I would give it a 7.7 out of 10. It's about the same, maybe 7.8, because it's only slightly better than the Xbox Series X, because at least the PlayStation 5 has a little bit more games for you to play, but Xbox and PlayStation in this last generations, the last two generations, have been basically the same head-to-head. It's not really, even though PlayStation-wise sales, they're doing better than Xbox, but they're practically the same console.